It seems like every time you think you've seen it all in the crypto world, something comes along and reminds you just how much more there is to learn.
It can definitely feel like a wild ride sometimes, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like, take the situation with this MVV token. There's a lot more going on there than meets the eye. It's a good reminder that things aren't always what they seem.
I think it really speaks to the fact that even in this space that's built on decentralization, certain players can still have an outsized influence on how things play out.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're taking a deep dive into some recent market manipulation involving the movie token, Binance, and a market maker who seems to have been a bit too clever for their own good. We've got some pretty incredible insights here that we're going to break down for you.
We'll try to cut through all the noise and get to the heart of what actually happened, why it matters, and what it could mean for the broader crypto market.
So before we get into the weeds, let's just kind of set the stage here.
Yeah.
Introduce our cast of characters. So first up, we've got Binance, one of the biggest global cryptocurrency exchanges out there.
Right.
Then we've got our mystery market maker, who's playing a pretty central role in all of this.
Pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Exactly. And then lastly, we have Movement, the team behind the MVE token itself, who kind of found themselves caught in the middle of it all.
Right in the crosshairs.
Yeah. So let's start with Binance's reaction to all of this, because they really didn't waste any time stepping in.
No, they didn't. I mean, their response was swift and decisive. They actually moved to freeze a pretty substantial amount of money, something like $38 million in profits, that was linked to the manipulative trading of the MVE token by this market maker.
$38 million. So that's not exactly chump change.
Yeah.
And the information we have here suggests that this is part of what's being called an increasingly assertive stance against market manipulation from Binance. So why is this such a big deal? What does this tell us about how things are evolving?
Well, it's interesting because if you look back at the early days of crypto, exchanges tended to take a much more hands-off approach.
Like a Wild West kind of vibe.
Exactly, yeah. But as the crypto market has matured and as it's attracted more regulatory scrutiny, these major platforms like Binance are realizing that they need to take a more active role in maintaining a level playing field. So this move suggests a real shift towards being more proactive in how they oversee their marketplaces.
Like they're really stepping up as the sheriff in town.
Exactly, keeping things in check.
And it's not like this was just a one-off thing with this particular market maker. We see here that there's actually a connection to an entity that Binance had previously banned from their platform. So it sounds like a pattern is emerging.
It does, doesn't it? The fact that this market maker had ties to someone that Binance had already shown the door to for similar behavior suggests a pretty deliberate attempt to try and get around the rules. And that likely played a big part in why Binance decided to make such a public example out of this case.
That public aspect of it seems pretty key here. Why do you think they chose to be so open about freezing those funds?
Well, I think you have to consider the broader context here. We've seen increasing regulatory interest from bodies like the DOJ and the SEC in the crypto space. And for an exchange like Binance, making a public display of enforcement can serve multiple purposes. First, it sends a message to regulators that they're taking market manipulation seriously.
They're not messing around.
Exactly. And second, it acts as a pretty strong deterrent to anyone else who might be thinking about pulling similar stunts.
Yeah, like don't even try it.
Exactly. And of course, it helps to reassure their own users that they're committed to maintaining a fair and transparent trading environment.
Transparency is definitely key. So what kind of ripple effects do you think this is going to have on other market makers out there? Do you think it'll make them more cautious? And what about the overall liquidity in the market? Could this have an impact on that?
Yeah, I think you're right to highlight that. This definitely raises some important questions about the behavior of market makers in general. If Binance is really signaling a stricter approach than those who've been operating in a more opaque manner, or who might be pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable, are likely to become a lot more careful about their actions. At least in the short term, we could see a decrease in liquidity for some tokens as market makers become more hesitant. But over the longer term, a trading environment that's perceived as fairer could actually attract more legitimate participants, and that could lead to a healthier, more sustainable level of liquidity overall.
So Binance is stepping up to be the crypto police in a way. But let's shift gears now and focus on Movement and the MOV token themselves, because they were really on the receiving end of this manipulation. Talking about a massive token dump here, 66 million tokens. And that resulted in a $38 million profit for the manipulator. So what does that tell us about Movement?
Well, it paints a picture of what our sources are calling fundamental weaknesses in movements, tokenomics, investing structures. To see a dump of that size generate that kind of profit, it suggests that either a huge chunk of tokens suddenly became unlocked and available to this market maker, or that the market maker had a disproportionate influence on the token's price, maybe because of relatively low trading volumes.
So to give listeners a sense of scale here,
Hmm.
at the time, MVE was trading around 46 cents with a daily trading volume of roughly $136 million. And suddenly this 66 million token dump hits the market. That's pretty significant.
It is. It really highlights the potential for imbalance when a single entity can exert that much control over the price. So this points to possible issues with how the MOV tokens were initially distributed or in the vesting schedules, which are basically the rules that determine when major holders can sell their tokens. If those mechanisms aren't well designed, it leaves the project vulnerable to this kind of exploitation.
And this situation raises some red flags for other crypto projects too, right?
Hmm.
Especially those that rely heavily on market makers.
Absolutely. A lot of newer projects in the crypto space lean on market makers to provide liquidity and help stabilize their token's price. But this incident shows just how important it is to do thorough due diligence on those market makers and to have ongoing oversight of those relationships. And, with the SEC potentially bringing in new regulations that could classify liquidity providers as dealers, things could get even more complex for projects that are working with market makers. We could see even bigger impacts on liquidity unless more transparent and regulated approaches are developed.
So a lot to unpack there. Now let's talk about how Movement reacted to all of this, because they did announce a $38 million buyback program. On the surface, that seems like a positive step to try and stabilize the price.
Yeah, it could be seen that way, but the analysis we've seen suggests that this might be more of a reactive move than a proactive one, and that could point to some underlying governance weaknesses. The fact that the buyback amount just happens to be the same as the profit taken by the manipulator, well, it does raise some questions about the timing and the motivation behind it all.
It does make you wonder. And they also created this new thing called the Movement Strategic Reserve after this happened, which sounds like they were scrambling to do some damage control.
It does have that feel, doesn't it? While the creation of a reserve like this might be intended to project an image of strength and preparedness, it also suggests that they maybe weren't as prepared as they could have been. A more established project might already have had such a reserve in place, along with clear protocols for dealing with a situation like this.
So it seems like they're trying to put out a fire. Now, there is a counter-argument being made that this actually shows resilience and strategic thinking on their part. But overall, the impression is more critical. It seems like this highlights some failures that were already there.
Exactly. While it's good to see them trying to mitigate the damage, the fact that this manipulation happened in the first place suggests a potential breakdown in their initial vetting processes for partners, like this market maker, and in their ongoing governance practices. You have to ask, why weren't these vulnerabilities addressed before it got to this point?
So while the buyback might give the MVE price a temporary boost, it doesn't necessarily address the deeper trust issues that this has created.
You're absolutely right. Pumping money back into the market can create artificial demand and support the price in the short term, but it doesn't solve the underlying lack of confidence that this incident has likely instilled in investors. The fundamental questions about the project's tokenomics and governance, those are still unanswered.
Yeah, those are pretty big question marks hanging over them. Now, Movement has a pretty interesting background, right? They're connected to Meta, formerly Facebook, and to the Diem stablecoin team. And they also use the Move programming language. Do any of these connections give them any kind of advantage in a situation like this?
That's a really good point. Their origins definitely gave them a certain amount of credibility from the start. They had access to some really experienced talent coming from those projects, and the Move programming language itself is pretty cutting edge. It's got some cool features like resource-oriented programming, which appeals to developers who are familiar with languages like Rust and TypeScript, and it was designed to be a more secure platform for building smart contracts.
So, from a technical perspective, they had a pretty solid foundation. But obviously that wasn't enough to prevent this market manipulation from happening.
You hit the nail on the head. Technical strength alone can't guarantee market stability or make you immune to manipulation. You need robust tokenomics, strong governance frameworks, and, crucially, you need to carefully select and oversee your partners, like market makers. This scandal really overshadows all those technical advantages they might have had.
Yeah, it's a tough lesson. And the information we have even suggests that this whole situation might end up indirectly benefiting other move-based ecosystems like Aptos and Sui, which haven't been caught up in similar scandals.
I think that's a very insightful observation. Developers and investors might start to look at projects like Aptos, which uses sharding to boost its network speed, or Sui, which has a really active gaming ecosystem, as potentially more reliable alternatives within the Move ecosystem, simply because they haven't been tainted by this kind of event.
So this whole thing really highlights the kind of push and pull that exists in the DeFi space, especially when you see a centralized exchange like Binance having to step in so forcefully.
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Binance's intervention, while it was probably necessary to protect users, represents a form of centralized enforcement in a system that's supposed to be decentralized. They essentially ended up acting as both the market regulator by identifying the manipulation and the enforcement agency by freezing the funds.
So despite all the talk about decentralization, centralized exchanges still hold a lot of power.
Oh, absolutely. They're still the main gateway to the crypto market for most people, and their actions have a huge impact on the whole ecosystem. This incident just underscores the fact that true decentralization when it comes to market oversight, well, it's still a work in progress.
A work in progress for sure. And this also ties into the broader regulatory landscape, right? We've seen increased activity from the DOJ and the SEC in the crypto space.
Exactly. This incident, along with other recent enforcement actions, is likely to fuel even more regulatory scrutiny of how market making works in the crypto world. Regulators are laser focused on tackling market manipulation and making sure investors are protected. And those potential new SEC rules for dealers that we talked about, those are a direct response to these concerns, and they could dramatically change how liquidity is provided in the future. Projects are going to need to be much more transparent and diligent in their relationships with market makers if they want to stay on the right side of the law.
Transparency and diligence, those are definitely the key words here. Now, the information we have lays out a really clear comparison of how this whole situation has impacted Movement, Aptos, and Sui, which I think helps to really clarify things.
I agree. It's a very helpful summary. So for Movement, the impact is obviously negative. They're in damage control mode, and their trust has taken a major hit. Aptos is facing a more indirect negative association just by virtue of being part of the Move ecosystem. But their ongoing technical developments and the fact that they're seen as having stronger governance, that helps to soften the blow. And Sui, well, they seem to be coming out of this relatively unscathed. They could even benefit from being seen as a safer, more reliable option.
So to wrap all this up,
Yeah.
what are your main takeaways from this whole saga involving Binance Movement and this market maker?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this isn't just about one token having a rough time. It exposes some really fundamental vulnerabilities that exist within the entire cryptocurrency market structure, vulnerabilities that go way beyond just one project. And Movement's response, while it involves a significant financial commitment, feels more like a band-aid solution than a real attempt to address the deeper issues around governance and oversight. The buyback might temporarily prop up the price, but it doesn't magically restore trust.
And the message to investors seems pretty clear.
Absolutely. Investors need to be incredibly cautious when it comes to projects that have opaque or poorly managed relationships with market makers. The fact that MOV's price hasn't really recovered that much since the buyback announcement, well, that speaks volumes about the market's skepticism. Movement has a long road ahead if they want to rebuild their credibility, especially with other strong contenders in the same space.
It sounds like an uphill battle for sure. So it seems pretty likely that this is going to have lasting negative consequences for Movement. And it could also lead to broader regulatory scrutiny of how market making operates across the whole crypto industry. As for the MOV token itself, I think it's safe to say that we can expect continued volatility even with the buyback efforts.
I think that's a very fair assessment. The market has a long memory, and rebuilding trust takes time and concrete action.
Time and action. So for our listeners out there, I think the big lesson here is that the MOV token incident is a really stark example of the potential risks and vulnerabilities that exist in the crypto market. It's a reminder that you really need to understand a project's tokenomics, its governance framework, and the constantly evolving regulatory landscape before you even think about investing.
And it raises a really important question. In a world that's supposedly all about decentralization, What role should centralized entities like exchanges play in making sure the market is fair and transparent? And ultimately, what does it really take to build a crypto project that's resilient and trustworthy enough to weather storms like this one? Do your research, dig into the tokenomics and the governance structures of any projects you're interested in.
Great advice. Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another look behind the curtain of what's happening in the crypto world.
See you next time.